promise. The promise is given first to Abraham. And Abraham, by and large, is a person of great virtue and righteousness. And the promise to Abraham is, leave your country and your kindred and your father's house. Those are all the things that make for security in the ancient world. You know, your country, your family. Father's house doesn't mean the building. It means your inheritance. Leave those things that make for worldly security in that ancient world, and instead become children of my promise and go to a land I will show you, still not named. Abraham has to go on faith. I will make you a great nation, not great, not meaning famous, but numerous. This is the promise of descendants. And by you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So that what it means to live the promise from Abraham forward is to trust that there's a place for us, a land. God will show us the place we are to be. There's a future for us. That's what descendants were all about in that ancient world. There's a future. And there's a mission to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. The promise is not for your benefit. The promise is so that you join God's mission to bless the families of a world that's now broken by sin. That's the promise. And to live the promise is to always go forward in trust. There's a place, there's a future, there's a mission for us. Abraham is generally a man of great righteousness. He sometimes has his shortcomings. He keeps trying to pass his wife off as his sister for some reason. And the book of Genesis in general is it's like those old Saturday serials at the movie where every episode ends with some new peril to the promise. Every episode is like the adventures of the promise. You know, I'm going to give you descendants as many as the sand of the sea, the sand on the shores of the sea, or the stars in the heavens. And pretty soon, you know, Abraham and Sarah say, well, you know, we're in our 90s now. Maybe we ought to get started on that enterprise. It seems to be a little slow getting started. You know, no sooner do they get to the land that God shows them than there's a famine and they have to go off to Egypt to find food. Finally, they have a child in their old age and they name him Isaac. I'm going to put Isaac up here, but, you know, there are hardly any stories really about Isaac. Well, now they finally have a son, and God says, take your son, your only son, whom you love, and go to the mountain I will show you, and sacrifice him there. And say, oh my God, what is going on here? Every episode puts the promise in peril. And sometimes the peril is the fundamental bearer of the promise, because if Jacob is basically virtuous, if Abraham is basically virtuous, Jacob is a rat. He's just not an admirable human being. He cheats his brother at every turn and deceives his father and ends up so alienated from his family that he goes into exile for the largest part of his life. But the message here is that, you know, even when those of us who receive the promise become less than admirable human beings, God's promise is going to go forward anyway. And maybe it'll go forward by eventually bringing us to that day that Jacob finally came to, when he's seized in the night by a visitor, wrestled with clear to the breaking of the day, always tries to control the situation. You know, the name Jacob means grasper. He's always trying to grasp for whatever he wants. It's a very self-centered name. Well, old Grasper tries to manipulate this situation too. Says, give me a blessing. Instead, this visitor touches his hip, and suddenly his thigh is out of joint. And I always pictured a kind of a cartoon at this point where there's a little bubble over Jacob's head and it says, uh-oh. There's something a little more going on in this wrestling match than just a human tag team. Jacob begins to suspect that this visitor is God coming to him in the midst of a human struggle. And he's genuinely wounded by this struggle. And so he's still trying to control the situation. So he says he can't. He demands a blessing and he doesn't receive it. And instead, this visitor says, no, instead of a blessing, I'm going to give you a new name. Your name now is going to be Israel, which means one who struggles with God. He says, because you've struggled with God and persevered, your name won't be Grasper anymore. You're going to have a new name to live up to. One who struggles with God. And you're going to leave this place wounded. And then the visitor blesses him. Not because Jacob demanded it, because that's the way God ends it. Blesses him. And Jacob it actually says this in the text, he limped away from there. He limped away from there. He is wounded. And he names that place Face of God, Peniel, which means face of God. And he's on his way back to reunite with Esau, and for all he knows, Esau still wants to kill him. But on the next day, when Esau meets him, Esau embraces and kisses him, has long since forgiven him. And what Jacob finally says in this reunion is truly to see your face is to see the face of God. So the path back to reunion with the alienated brother lay through the way God encounters Jacob, maybe the way God encounters us in the midst of human struggles that turn out to have divine presence in their midst, and the possibility of new names and new futures. But such struggles are real. They wound us. They sometimes are painful. But it's in that way that we sometimes, if we're the stubborn Jacobs of the world, that we finally learn to see the face of God even in those we most feared. Even in those we most feared. Well, those are great stories. But the stories of promise end with the story of one of Jacob's sons who, of all things, ends up in Egypt. It's a wonderful story. You all know the story. I sometimes act out the whole drama of Joseph and his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, but we don't really have time for that tonight. I love that musical. All of the rich characters and every piece of music, parodying a different type of music. You know, I always liked the Pharaoh when he comes to tell Joseph his dream. Naturally, the Pharaoh is the king. Well, if you're the king, who is that in music? Well, I was wandering along by the banks of the river when 7 fat cows came out of the Nile. Joseph, when he's finally reunited with his brothers, he says, "You meant it to me for evil, but God meant it for good." One of the things we're learning all the way along here is that the human enterprise can be a pretty rocky road. We're sinners. We break relationship. But God, nevertheless, can use even evil for good. God redeems us, that along the way there haven't only been the Cains and the brothers who sold off Joseph into slavery. There have been the Abrahams, the Noahs. We model both righteousness and brokenness in our mixed up human experience, and God is working through them all. But the problem with Joseph is that everybody ends up in Egypt. We're not in the land. We're instead in a place where generations later, the Bible says it's over 400 years between the time of Joseph and the opening of the book of Exodus. In Exodus 1 verse 8 is one of the most ominous lines in the Old Testament. It says, "Now there arose a king who did not know Joseph." Uh-oh. Joseph may have been the second in command to a Pharaoh, but those days are long forgotten. There's come a time when the pharaohs on the throne of Egypt are not friendly to the foreigners who live in their land. If you studied ancient Egyptian history, you'd learn that we've shifted from the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom to the pharaohs of the New Kingdom. And the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom were foreigners on the throne of Egypt, and the pharaohs of the New Kingdom threw them out. And they didn't know or care about Joseph. And so, instead, they are increasingly restricted to the point that they are enslaved and spend generations in bondage in Egypt. And, the Bible knows an awful lot about human psychology without psychology having been invented yet. The Bible knows that oppressors fear the people they oppress. And it says that the Pharaoh was so fearful of these people who, even though they were slaves, were multiplying, and that he says, we've got to control this population, and so commands that all the firstborn be killed. You know the story. Out of this cauldron of oppression, we begin to see the stirrings of something that will create an alternative. But the first place we see that is not in God. I'm going to put bondage up here. Slavery. Before God is even mentioned in the story of the slaves in Egypt, we have 5 women who model a hopeful future. 2 midwives of Israel, Shiphrah and Puah, who outwit the Pharaoh and his plot to kill all the firstborn. A mother and a sister who watch the infant Moses and make sure he comes to a safe place. And a princess who defies the edict of her own father and takes Moses in to raise him as her own. 5 women who model grace and hope and new life before God even enters the story. This is a Methodist church. You know what? John Wesley talked about this kind of grace. He called it prevenient grace. It's the grace that goes before we even know how to name it. We've all been the recipient of God's grace. And grace enters this story before God even begins to be active. But that's God's prevenient grace. God does enter the story, though, and especially enters the story with the introduction of Moses into the story. We're now in the story of the Exodus experience. And big central character here is Moses. The Exodus story, the first 15 chapters of the book of Exodus, is what I call the birth story of Israel. This was where Israel really gets born as a people. Israel in bondage in Egypt is not yet a people. Well, what about all those stories in Genesis? Well, if this is the birth story, that's the story of the gestation period. But if we want to leave the birth analogy behind, those are the stories of the promise, and now we've begun the stories of fulfillment. God is now truly going to raise up a people, a future. God is going to take them back to the land. God is going to covenant with these people to join God's enterprise of blessing all the families of the earth. The stories of Exodus 1 to 15 are the stories of fulfillment, where all these things start to take concrete form in a people of God. And Exodus is the great central salvation story of the Old Testament, just like resurrection is the great salvation story of the New Testament. Cross to resurrection. Here it's bondage to new life through the sea. It's the same dynamic going on there. And God calls Moses out of the burning bush to become his agent in this enterprise. Exodus 3 is one of the great chapters in the whole Bible. And it's sometimes called the story of the call of Moses, and it is that. But it's also a story of the self-revelation of God. We've seen God the Creator and God the promise giver. Now God is revealing to Moses some new aspects of the divine character. In Exodus 3 verse 7, God says, I have seen the affliction of my people. I have heard their cries because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them. You can take those 4 verbs and those 4 phrases, and you've got a pretty good basic theology of God to build around. A God who sees and hears. And what does God see and hear? God sees affliction. God hears cries. This is not the God of the other religions of the ancient world. This is a new kind of God. You know who the gods of Egypt were? Who the gods of Mesopotamia were? Who the gods of Canaan were? They were the gods who were identified with the powerful. If you wanted to look for gods in the religions of the ancient world, you looked for the power centers. And you found that in the pharaohs and the kings and the high priests and the nobility. It's an absolutely unheard of God to be revealed in care and concern for slaves who have no standing in the world's terms. This is an upside down kind of God, but it's also, I want to suggest, a God of radical freedom. This God is not tied to the fortunes of the powerful in the world. This God chooses to see and hear in terms of those pressed into the margins. At the point of our greatest need, this God sees and hears. But even more to the point, the third verb in that verse is, God says to Moses, I know their sufferings. I already said to you a little bit earlier that the Hebrew verb to know is broader than our verb. It doesn't mean just knowledge in the head. It means to experience and participate in what is known, so that God is almost saying here, I participate in their suffering. It's the introduction of a theme I call the vulnerability of God. We're used to saying things like the all-powerful God. Well, God is all-powerful. But God chooses to be vulnerable. You know what vulnerable means? Vulnerable means you're able to be wounded. You know, Superman is invulnerable. Bullets bounce off his chest. except when there's kryptonite around, but that's another story. God chooses to be wounded with our woundedness. God is all-powerful, but God in divine freedom chooses to participate in human suffering, and not just to experience our suffering with us, but the last verb is, and I have come down to deliver. God then chooses to enter human history to make new alternatives of life possible where death seems to be speaking the final word. This is nothing more than the same dynamic we find at the heart of the New Testament in the relationship between cross and empty tomb. What could be the greater expression of the vulnerability of God than the God who dies for us on a cross as the Word become flesh, and yet makes new life possible in the unexpected emptiness of the tomb, and life has the final word. So too, God has come down to deliver the Hebrews out of bondage to the Egyptians. But when they come up against the sea and think that death is about to speak the final word, the powers of the world are about to have the final say, a way opens through the sea and they pass through to new life. What could be more unexpected than that? And so, in the Exodus experience, death becomes life through the power of God. I always loved it about that verse back there at the burning bush. God says, I have seen, I've heard, I know, I've come down to deliver, so Moses, you go to the Pharaoh. Because whatever God is doing, a part of the biblical story is that God chose in creating us in the first place to be in relationship, and there's no part of God's story of salvation that God is not also enlisting human agents into the enterprise. And most of the time they're reluctant. Moses says, I think you must have the wrong person. I don't even know your name, and I don't talk too well, and you haven't given me any signs. And God patiently addresses all of these issues and then says, go. But it happens over and over again. Abraham and Sarah say, oh, God, we're too old. Jeremiah says, I'm too young, I'm just a boy. Ezekiel says, well, I might be your prophet, but I don't know what to say. And God says, eat this scroll. Talk about putting words in someone's mouth. And, Gideon is scared to death down in a hole in the ground threshing wheat so the Midianites won't see him. He's in a wine press threshing grain. And God comes in the form of a black-bearded stranger and says, the Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor. Cowering down there at the bottom of the wine press. And Gideon, of course, says, you couldn't possibly mean me. I'm from the least tribe of Israel. I'm the donkey of the tribe. God overrides our objections and insists that God is not going to be active for our salvation without enlisting us into the enterprise. And Moses becomes the perfect example of this. He objected 5 times before he finally went, but becomes, of course, one of the great champions of the faith as the story unfolds. Life and death takes place at the sea. When a path opens from death to life through the midst of the sea, but it wouldn't have been enough just to be on the other side of the sea. They could have had a few days of singing and dancing with Miriam over there. It was a heck of a party, I think. And then people could have said, that was really great. I'm going to remember that my whole life. I'll see you later. I hope I run into you sometime as the years unfold, and they all would go their different ways. And we wouldn't even be sitting here because the story wouldn't have gone anywhere. You see, it's not enough just to experience God's salvation. They have to go on to Sinai and learn what it means to be God's community. There has to be a community that tells the story of God's salvation to generation after generation. So that the community does that in its worship life. Eventually does that in its scripture, but that's a far end of the story. And the community also has to live differently because they've experienced God's salvation. If you end up living just like the Egyptians, what did it mean? If you don't become a different kind of community than the communities of the world, then what difference did it all make? And so Sinai is where they live for a long period of time. You know, they encamp at Sinai for a long time. And at Sinai, they are shaped into God's covenant people. Not without struggles. You remember that little golden calf bit. Not without demands. You know, there are these 10 commandments as a beginning point. Not without actually spelling out the implications of what it means to be God's covenant community. You know, we got to have law codes. Because otherwise, where would your Bible reading programs go astray except when you get to Leviticus? You know, the law codes aren't for easy bedtime reading. They're because people took seriously trying to spell out what covenant meant in the terms and the context of their own times. You know, none of those law codes were supposed to do that job for us. There's about 5 law codes in the Old Testament, and each one of them reflects a different period of Israel's life, because deciding how to live as God's covenant people has to be redone in every generation. There are common themes there. We can learn a lot from those law codes. You know what one of the greatest number of laws is all about? It's about food. It says everybody ought to have food, and we better make some structures that make that possible. And we want that food to be available to all. We want there to be equality of opportunity. The economics of covenant have got to be an economics of equality. And the politics of covenant have to honor everybody as a member of the community. So we want a politics of justice. So suddenly there's developing a covenant vocabulary. We're supposed to live out justice. We're supposed to do righteousness. We're supposed to seek shalom. That's the goal of covenant. Shalom means wholeness, not just peace. It means wholeness. And God models perhaps the most important quality of covenant. God says covenant's a two-way street. And so God's commitment is, my steadfast love endures forever. And so love is at the heart of what it means to be either God or God's people. God's steadfast love endures forever. It's a special Hebrew word, chesed. It doesn't mean romantic love. It means committed love. Love that's committed through the hardships and the tough times, as well as the mountaintop times. And the 10 Commandments are just the most foundational way of defining our obligations to God and neighbor. The law codes are attempts to get more specific about it. And the result is covenant, an alternative community of God's people in the midst of the world. There's a long period of struggle in the wilderness. I always think it's really helpful to understand that deliverance is not straight into the promised land. It's into the wilderness. You know, there's something really to be learned here, because sometimes we think The moment when we experience God's salvation is the end of the story, when it's really only the beginning. You know, I sometimes run into people who say, I found Jesus and now I'm happy, happy, happy. And I say, you know, there's going to be challenges and struggles in that life with Jesus. Well, the salvation story is the same here. We're delivered from the death of bondage.